During the Second World War, over 100,000 Dutch Jews were murdered by the Nazis. Many of them were deported via a transit camp located in German-occupied Netherlands. The transit camp was named Westerbork, and that's where I'm now at. But did you know that life at Camp Westerbork was not that bad? Why was that? In this video you're going to learn about life in Camp Westerbork during the Second World War. Camp Westerbork was not a creation of the German occupier. It was built on the orders of the Dutch government in 1939. It was not planned to be a cog in the Nazi destruction machine, but built to serve as a reception camp for Jewish refugees. Camp Westerbork was built in 1939 as a central refugee camp commissioned by the Dutch government to receive Jewish refugees from Germany. Already after Adolf Hitler's rise to power in Germany in 1933, the first Jewish refugees came to the Netherlands. The Dutch government admitted these refugees with great reluctance. Economic arguments generally outweighed humanitarian considerations. Do notice this was the time of the Great Depression. In May 1938, the Dutch-German border closed completely. But then, in November that year, the Night of the Broken Glass, also known as the Reichskristallnacht or the Reichspogromsnacht, took place, and more Jewish refugees entered the Netherlands illegally. Something had to be done to house this many people. They were admitted on the condition that these refugees were to be housed in a camp. But where was this camp going to be built? Well, one location was found, only Dutch Queen Wilhelmina found this location too close to her summer residence, and thus another location was found in the municipality of Westerbork near the village of Hooghalen, away from the inhabited world. In December 1939, construction began, and by October the first refugees arrived. Do notice that at that time the camp was still under construction, as one refugee said about his arrival. The further we got, the lonelier it became. At one point all you could see were moors, occasional bushes, and where eventually the refugee camp would be. There was a huge plain where there was only heather and sand, and what was very desolate. Until May 10th, 1940, the population increased to 700 people. And then the German invasion of the Netherlands commenced. Efforts were made to evacuate the refugees, but this failed. And after the German takeover, the refugees had to stay put in the camp and had great difficulty to venture outside the camp. They had to get a special permission for that. In the initial months, the Dutch themselves guarded the camp. The approximately 140,000 Dutch Jews could live in relative peace in the initial stages of the occupation of the Netherlands. The first step of persecution was segregation, because in April 1942 the Dutch Jews were obliged to wear the yellow Star of David on their clothes. And the second phase was the concentration of a large portion of Jews in special neighborhoods in Amsterdam. In the next step of the occupying forces against Jews, Camp Westerbork played a central role. The Jews were to be sent to labor camps in German-occupied Eastern Europe, and for this relocation to run as smoothly as possible, the Nazis needed a transit camp. And for this purpose, the refugee camp at Westerbork was eminently suitable. In late 1941, the decision was made to prepare Westerbork for deportation purposes. The costs, such as the expansion of 24 large barracks, were paid with the confiscated Jewish assets. What was really going to happen to the Jews was discussed at the Wannsee Conference, January 20, 1942. The decision was made for the systematic, large-scale and industrial murder of all Jews in occupied Europe. On the 1st of July 1942, Camp Westerbork was taken over by the Befehlshaber der Sicherheitspolizei und der SD, the apparatus of the German political investigation and secret intelligence service. All the Jews in the Netherlands had to be deported from Camp Westerbork. And the number of Jews that had to be transported from Westerbork on a given day was communicated from Berlin. And they were drawn from the reservoir that was Transit Camp Westerbork. It was important for the Nazis to keep the population level in this camp at a minimum required level in order to be able to supply the requested transport material at a given moment. The leadership of the camp had been in the hands of SS Obersturmführer Albert Konrad Gemmaker since October 1942. The leadership in Berlin wanted to deport the Jews from the Netherlands as as quickly and quietly as possible. And Gammaker took great pride in running the camp as smoothly as possible, without friction and without incidents. He emerged as a neat gentleman who treated the Jews correctly. From day-to-day affairs, he hardly intervened. His main concern was to meet the number of required Jews to be put on transport, and he left the organization to the prisoners themselves. Functioning like a prince within the camp was the German Jew Kurt Schlesinger. He was the first administrative director. Here the transport lists were compiled. As long as the Jewish camp staff kept the number of people to be deported passed on by Gammaker, their power over fellow prisoners was great, and they were able to take others into protection from those who held office and the masses. And those who held office were mostly German Jews, and as a result there was a great animosity within the camp between the Dutch and German Jews. The camp organization had many departments. There was an extensive administration where the camp's population register was kept. Here the new arrivals had to report and were registered. Until November 42, the prisoners had to perform a 5-kilometer walk from the station in Hooghaarlem to Camp Westerbork. Later a train track was laid to the camp itself. After surrendering their valuables, the newly registered prisoners could seek their living quarter. The camp police was in charge of guarding the penal barracks located within the camp and had to ensure peace and order. When transports left, members of this service had to help out, and this explains the name Jewish SS that some gave them. The camp organization worked splendidly. There were hardly any incidents. The Nazis used the system of divide and conquer. Most prisoners only stayed a few hours in Westerbork, others a couple of days and others a couple of weeks before they were sent on transport to the extermination camps in occupied Eastern Europe. The drinking water in the camp was poor, the food was reasonably good and sufficient, and people could also receive food parcels from outside. There was also a well-stocked canteen where people could purchase things with camp money. That was what they got in return when they handed over their valuables. The housing was highly inadequate. Almost all prisoners were housed in barracks in which men and women slept separately. The barracks were cramped with cribs, always 3 above each other. In the barracks there was no privacy and always crowds and noise. For many prisoners there was work in the kitchen, in the sick barracks, but also in workshops or businesses. For example, there was a rag sorting shop, a sewing and shoe workshop, a workshop for processing garbage, and an aircraft junkyard. People worked mostly from 7 a.m. to noon and from 2 p.m. to 7 p.m. Food was obtained from the central kitchen at noon and again at 7 in the evenings. And in the evenings and Sundays, people were free. And during their free time, people could walk aimlessly on the campsites. Many held talks about the past endlessly, and rumors about what the future would bring, and especially by making attempts to be exempted from deportation. There was also relaxation for those who wanted it: music, ballet, theater, cabaret, and sports competitions. Small children were kept at a nursery, and children at the age of 6 to 15 went to a school. First there was one school and later there were more schools. Now one prisoner who did not go to school was Anne Frank. She arrived in the camp with her family and the others that were in hiding in the penal barracks because they had violated the occupation law of going into hiding, and therefore they were placed in the penal barracks, which was like a prison within the camp. And the people there, they were basically the first to be put on deportation. And Frank and her family were deported from Westerbork on September 3rd, 1944, and Anne Frank herself, she would die in Bergen-Belsen somewhere in February-March 1945. Westerbork in some ways resembled an ordinary Dutch town during occupation time. Children were born and people died, marriages were made, and marital and neighborly quarrels were fought. The camp commander, he allowed recreational activities, and the Nazis were basically up to create the impression that life after the camp wasn't so bad after all. There was even a hospital in Westerbork. This all created the illusion that the Jews would be sent to labor camps in Eastern Europe. Even letters from Auschwitz appeared, fake letters, in which it was said that the work was hard, but they were doing well. There were doubts though when trains left with only elderly, sick, or children, And there were rumors that the Nazis had little good intentions, especially the German Jews. They had no faith in good intentions from the Nazis. But nobody knew what was waiting for them in occupied Poland. And only a very few guessed that murder would await them. The sense of impending doom explained the desperate attempts to escape deportation by clinging to labor in the hope of thereby being indispensable, by obtaining positions which gave exemption from transport, and above all by obtaining a stamp. So despite the fact that many had false hopes and labor would await them in Eastern Europe, the weekly deportations were like some kind of impending doom people tried to escape. Now, speaking about escaping, only a few hundred people escaped the camp itself. And escaping Westerbork actually wasn't that hard. Not only did many work for farmers in the area where there was little surveillance, but one could be sent elsewhere for all sorts of assignments. So opportunities to escape were there. But here was the thing. When you would escape, your family was still in the camp. And if you were missing, your family would be put on transport next. And this deterred most, especially because most had no idea where to go. The decent treatment by the Nazis, the system of exemptions, the hospital had no other purpose than to create the illusion for the people in Camp Westerbork. Camp Westerbork was a deportation machine. Life there was controlled from week to week by the transport, with always the question on whether one could be deported oneself. Deportations took place on Tuesday. On July 15, 1942, the first deportation train left from the station of Hooghaarlem. The transport of this day to the next included 2,030 people, including orphans. Until October 12, 1942, 24 trains with 23,700 Jews left. All of them stayed in Westerbork for only a short time, some only to be registered. From the beginning of February 1943, there was a weekly rhythm. Every Tuesday, a train left with an average of 1,000 people. Goods wagons were used almost exclusively. In order to avoid unnecessary unrest, it was determined only a few hours before departure who was to be put on transport. One was allowed a limited amount of luggage. All were packed on the ground in a wagon with one barrel in the corner for necessities, and in the other corner was a barrel filled with water. Food was not provided. The destination was Auschwitz or, for some months in 1943, Sobibor. In a few cases, Theresienstadt or Bergen-Belsen. The last transport left on September 13, 1944. Among other things, it carried away 77 discovered children in hiding. More than 100,000 people had been deported from Camp Westerbork by 93 trains. Among them were also 245 Roma and Sinti, or gypsies, and here you see images that were made by Werner Breslauer. One of the most iconic images from Breslauer's footage is of a young Sinti girl named Stella Steinbach. As she boards the train for deportation, she would later be murdered in Auschwitz-Birkenau. When the camp was liberated on the 12th of April 1945, there were still 876 prisoners left. A few weeks later, the camp received a new destination and different occupants. On April 26, 1945, the first transport of Dutch collaborators of the NSB entered Camp Westerbork. Camp Westerbork would now serve as an internment camp for collaborators and alleged collaborators. Now, the Jews could not leave right away, and there was some time that basically the Jews and the collaborators were staying in the camp at the same time. Now, that summer, the last Jews left Westerbork. Camp Westerbork was not the only, but surely the largest camp for NSB members and collaborators. There was inadequate medical care, there was barely any food, there were daily riots, abuses, beatings, and that basically ended in 1948 when the last prisoners left the camp. Camp Commander Gammaker, he was arrested after the war. Now, he was claimed he did not know about the fate of the deportees sent from Westerbork. He was sentenced to prison and released in 1951, and he was later interviewed.
Wohin? Ja, das war mir bekannt. Das Ziel war Auschwitz.
Ja.
Das war mir bekannt.
Wussten Sie, was dort geschieht?
Nein, das wusste ich nicht. Wir haben selbst versucht, nachdem einmal Gerüchte über das, was wir später gehört haben, zu uns gelangten, darüber Näheres zu erfahren. Ich bin selbst zu meinem Befehlshaber gefahren, habe danach gefragt. Man hat mir gesagt, das sei sogenannte Gräuelpropaganda, Kriegshetze.
Later, the Dutch Ministry of War was able to use the site as a military encampment for repeat exercises. After less than a year, the soldiers left the camp and Camp Westerbork became vacant. But not for long, because in July 1950, under the name de Schattenberg, the camp became a reception for the returnees of the former Dutch East Indies. Shortly after, they had to leave the camp to make room for new residents. In March 1942, the first ex-KNIL soldiers of Moluccan descent and their families entered the camp. More than 3,000 Moluccans lived in the camp, and the last families left the camp in 1971. In that year, the last barracks were demolished or sold to farmers. Several years earlier, the first radio telescope was installed on the grounds of Camp Westerbork, and later a dozen more followed. The interference-free zone of the telescope made it necessary for the museum to be located 3 kilometers away. In 1983, Queen Beatrix opened the Remembrance Center Camp Westerbork. And that's what the former campsite is today. I hope you found this video interesting. If you'd like to learn about why so many Dutch Jews were deported during World War II, click right here. I want to thank you for watching. See you later.